colleague, Dr. Ellen Bassett, who was part of Risha's educational journey. And I was so glad to meet her, to learn more about her expertise in sustainability and sustainability measures and indicators. And I'm so happy that she's come this evening to talk with us about her work and to introduce us to some new concepts. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Risha.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra. It's really nice to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. It's also a great way to, share with you and, the audience today about things that I do and, you know, sort of what I plan to do as I try to pivot my journey as an environmental planner and what that means to me personally. Hello everyone. I'm Richa Vuppuluri, and I feel like over the past 10, 15 years, I have dabbled in sort of many realms of built environment, from planning, urban design, and architecture. I'm trained as an architect and an urban designer, but I've mostly worked in the planning realm. And most recently, I completed my PhD from UVA's interdisciplinary program in the built environment from the School of Architecture, where I focused sort of past 5 to 6 years of my research in really understanding sort of components of human behavior in our built environment, and how is behavior sort of a dependent and an independent factor in managing our urban environments. And so that for me was a really interesting way of repositioning my work, apart from sort of the planning and design skills that I have acquired over the last few years. And so today I really wanted to use this opportunity to share with y'all about what is sort of my perspective on sustainable urban practices through what I'm calling this people-centric approach. And especially in the face of climate change, it becomes really important to understand how are we sort of foregrounding behavior in our decision making. And so, Sandra and I have had discussions about formulating a course, hopefully on global cities and environments that sort of cover some of these concepts on people and behavior. So I just wanted to, let's see, move my slide. All right, great. So, this is sort of the core concept of what I'm trying to share with you all today, in terms of the complexity of environments and urban ecosystems. And it's really the human behavior which is at the core of most of our interventions, and human behavior could be at the individual, group, or entities or organizational levels, and it really sort of ends up becoming the most critical factor in our practice, and more so in complex urban environments in our rapidly growing and developing cities of the global south. And so in really understanding the environmental challenges, I sort of position that we have to understand these issues as sort of social factors and social issues, and really what are the human components that drive our environment, and then how can we as practitioners sort of really position our interventions and policies through the people or community focus. And so this is how I thought I'll structure my talk today, in these 4 or 5 parts. And I wanted to begin by sort of explaining what I mean by urban ecosystems, and sort of expanding on that a little bit, and talking about environmental behavior, which is sort of a complement to our sort of engineering or technocratic approaches, which seems like the conventional way of planning practices. But also, I wanted to share some of my own research in the city of Mumbai on urban water management, where I have tried to apply some of these concepts. And then I wanted to end by sort of zooming out and reflecting on the behavioral opportunities when we think about broader urban infrastructure systems. And so, beginning by understanding urban ecosystems. An urban ecosystem essentially is a dynamic system comprising of the physical, biological, and social components, which are found all within our urban areas. And it essentially integrates human-made environments such as buildings, roads, parks, natural elements like the trees, water bodies, wildlife, and sort of all are, engineered interventions as well. And so these ecosystems are then characterized by their unique energy flows, material cycles, biodiversity, and a lot of a lot of human level decisions that guide these systems. But more importantly, urban ecosystems are also heavily influenced by human activities and management practices, right? And so urban ecosystems then play a crucial role in sustaining the quality of life for city dwellers. Its ecosystem services such as air, water, urban comfort, recreational spaces. And at the same time, these urban ecosystems are also under what I say, they're under constant threat due to pollution, resource depletion, habitat fragmentation, and all these issues in our urban environments. And so I will expand more on this through a case on urban water management in cities. But this is the sort of broader ideas about how you think about urban ecosystems and services. And so I, as part of my research, started looking at urban water management issues through the idea of urban rivers in cities in India. And I had been sort of practicing, sustainable infrastructure planning a lot more in cities in North America. And I come from Mumbai city, and I really wanted to start applying all these concepts to the place where I come from and the culture that I, very closely relate with. And so this research of mine, the doctoral research that I did sort of really became the way to, again, intervene in cities in India. And so I started looking at cities like New Delhi, Chennai, and Mumbai, and really sort of understanding what are their key, major urban water systems, mainly urban rivers. And these are sort of external water systems, not the ones related to water supply and management. And in terms of physical forms, each of these cities then have very distinct characteristics in terms of New Delhi is more sort of landlocked in India, Chennai is along the coast, and Mumbai is also a coastal city, but it's an island city that has been reclaimed over the years. And so now the complexity of these urban ecosystems in these contexts is even more exacerbated by the condition of these urban rivers. And there are many multiple reasons. It could be, lacking resources, governance issues, informal settlements, service provisioning. And so these are sort of really highly complex systems where there isn't the sort of 1, 2, or 3 factors which you could focus on to restore these river systems. There are sort of multiple issues that add to the complexity of these ecosystems or the resource that we are trying to restore in these contexts, right? And so I will focus a little bit on Mumbai city, and this is just a snapshot of the river that I have been studying for the past 5 years. Really, this is not just a problem of Mumbai, and how the decision makers are sort of shaping the water management and the environment of the city, but this could also be sort of any any sort of urban river in rapidly developing cities of the global south. And what you see here is a river in Dhaka in Bangladesh. This is another river in Johannesburg, South Africa, in Argentina. And this is not just what I'm trying to establish here is that this is not just a problem of Mumbai city, but this is sort of very much what you would see in most sort of these rapidly growing contexts of the global south. And so it's important to sort of keep going back and forth and understanding the application of what we're trying to establish here. And so these are highly vulnerable ecosystems due to a lot of environmental factors, but also these floodplains are sort of highly built upon, whether it's development or informal settlements. But they're also, the population that lives here is highly vulnerable. Mostly they would be, the poor and the ones who are sort of trying to be closer to city and work opportunities. And that's really the sort of socio-ecological context of these urban rivers. And then I wanted to move. So with this sort of background, I wanted to position this, the beyond engineering or the people-centric perspective. And by engineering, I don't mean, so by engineering I mean like the technocratic approach, right? Which is usually driven by, okay, we have this great problem, let's bring in experts. And, this is mostly driven by public officials. You bring international experts and you sort of, roll out tenders for a problem that is sort of more context and place-based, right? And so how do you sort of start to flip that approach and think about it through the local context? But usually, how these issues really come to light when they're so complex that we start thinking about this sort of more conventional approach where, let's bring in the experts, or let's bring in the engineers. Whereas, what I'm trying to say here is that probably a lot of these approaches or solutions at the local level could be way more effective. And building on my own background in architecture, urban planning, I wanted to understand, as I mentioned, what environmental behavior is. And so essentially, environmental behavior builds on how humans impact the built environment and vice versa. And this is also called the pro-environmental behavior, and it is rooted in environmental psychology. It aims to minimize harm on the environment and sort of promote positive behavior for the environment. And in urban context, what I sort of propose is that really, pro-environmental behavior can lead to community stewardship and ownership of natural resources, which is really the key missing piece in our sort of conventional practices of, planning, policy making, and engineering. And so, this sort of begins by understanding what is the source of environmental behavior. And the source of behavior is really defined by the capability, opportunity, and the motivation. And these are sort of the three factors that drive a behavior. And these could be sort of like social, physical, or at psychological levels, but they can also function at, operational, tactical, or strategic levels. So there are many ways about thinking about the source of behavior in these contexts. And so, expanding on that, how is sort of the human and the spatial factors really, driving the environmental behavior component? And so that, this is sort of the core of, the pro-environmental behavior approach. And it's, through this framework, we can sort of begin to expand into policies and interventions. Once you start to sort of identify the target behavior or the range of behaviors for these issues, you can really start to think about the combination of interventions and the impact on policies and vice versa. And I'll talk a little bit more about what these interventions and policies mean through the case study that I will present to you. But this is sort of the fundamental idea, and looking at sort of one ecosystem of urban rivers in a city. And breaking this down further, this is how sort of I approached policies and interventions, by proposing these sort of BCTs that I call them, but they are really behavior change techniques. Now, behavior change techniques are not just so sort of focusing on an individual and their behavior, but it also sort of expands into the physical interventions or the environmental restructuring, service provisioning. But so it does include all our sort of conventional ways of working and planning as well. But how do you sort of foreground the behavioral approach in terms of resolving these urban issues? And I don't think I'll go more into this. I can get back to this if someone has interest, but this is sort of really the model for altering a target behavior, where I talked about the capability, opportunity, and motivation. And the application of these could be at individual or household levels, at group stakeholders or organizational levels, and also these it's sort of the factors that it influences could be agencies, cognitive functions. We could think about norms, powers, issues of transparency, accountability. A lot of these sort of started to come into focus when I was looking at the urban river issue in Mumbai city. But this is just sort of one way that the framework could be used in terms of sort of environmental challenges. And so just focusing a little bit more on the case of Mumbai city, this is just a snapshot of one point in the Methi River, which I'll be studying more in detail, and I'll share with you. But the idea is that this was one of the environmental activists who insisted that really the concept of a river is lost on the population of the city, and majority of people don't even know that this river exists. And so when you don't see something, you don't have any sense of ownership, and there is no sort of relationship of people with the river, because it has just been reduced to a utilitarian drain, and it is sort of completely detached the people from this natural resource. And this statement sort of really exemplifies the sort of institutional narrative that is surrounding this river, where the perception of what this river is really determines the fate of what happens to this urban resource. And of course, this is just one of the factors, but there is pollution, there's climate change, there is sea level impact, but all of this sort of only aggravates what this river ends up how this river ends up shaping the city and its ecology. And so the way I started working in this context was really understanding and identifying the decision-making community for this river. And I thought about it from looking at all the way from local or ground level initiatives to sort of international banks that really fund these kind of big infrastructure projects, national level or state level, which are really sort of driving the policy decisions, aid for these rivers. And then, looking more at the sort of state, regional, city, local neighborhood levels. And these are really professionals or community agents that are driving the implementation of these interventions. And then there are, of course, private institutions, other services, NGOs who sort of really provide the research services and support community towards this urban resource. And so how can you start to think about a decision-making community through this broad perspective? And this is how I began thinking about the river pollution in the city. And so I won't go into the details over here, but it's as you can see, it's a very highly complex network of owners, operators, residents, and so it's really starting to understand the complexity of ownership and people and the decision-making community that actually impact this urban river becomes the basis of this kind of an approach, right? And then these are sort of the 30 expert respondents and community representatives that participated in my sort of research study. But the idea is that this could be configured in many different ways, but do we do we have an equitable representation of the decision making community when we're thinking about the river? And it's not just the state or the local officials, but there has to be a consensus making sort of platform for all sort of community stakeholders. And looking spatially at this river, it becomes important to understand that Mumbai is an island city, and the river and its watershed that is highlighted in pink is essentially on reclaimed land as a result of 150 plus years of city development. And the lower reaches of the watershed have ended up in low-lying areas, and it is also subject to tidal action from the sea. And so one is looking at the decision-making community and the people that reside along these urban resources and urban rivers, but also what is the environmental history and the spatial factor that drives the health of these urban rivers. And so, just looking at the leftmost map of the Methi River, it's in pink is the watershed of, is the study watershed that I'm looking at for the river. And this is a river, it's an urban river because it originates and it ends within the city, and it traverses through a dense urban fabric of the city as shown in the center of the map, and it empties into the Arabian Sea. And about 6 kilometers of the river is in the lower reaches of the city, which I mentioned is also subject to tidal action. And so there are a lot of these physical environmental factors also that add to the challenges. And here I will just present a very quick walkthrough in terms of what what this urban river really feels like on the ground. And this is sort of really when the complexity of ownership and the ground condition starts to unravel. And this is right at the origin where the river looks really the river is actually quite pristine. It's the origin waterhead at the higher level elevation of the city. And it starts in the Bihar Lake. It's a protected national park, and then it sort of traverses through. This is still at the beginning of the river. There are actually tribal communities that live around there. And then one of the respondents for my research was a Varli artist, a tribe who actually he represented this tribe that actually live in this community inside the protected area. But then very quickly after the national park, we start to see huge informal settlements that have inhabited this space since the 80s and the 90s. And then, extending further into these kind of areas called Filterpara, which is full of informal settlements and low-income housing. And then further down, this is around an industrial site where today we see these huge sort of retaining walls that have been installed over the recent past 5 to 7 years. And, we see almost year-round dredging activities on the river now because it is so highly polluted. And then in the middle reaches are these middle-income dense apartment complexes. And one of the participant respondents was from one of these buildings around here that I photographed this from. And so, and then further down is this sort of mixed-use development. It's a really dense road network infrastructure crisscrossing the river. And then interestingly, the airport occupies a huge part of the river basin. And the airport has actually tried to highly engineer the river to accommodate runway expansion over the past 2 decades. So you can think that, that this is the international airport that actually occupies, the river basin, and it has been highly, changing the river course to, accommodate sort of its capacity or, increased demands. And then the lower reaches of the river are swaths of these informal settlements and industry that deal with scrap and recycling. And then, there is this sort of dense middle income housing. There are these sort of toilet blocks that are around this river. And then there are these, temporary markets that come up once every week. And so there is a lot of the sort of character of the river. And then, really towards the end of the river, if you're following along, is a stretch of these mangroves, which of course are meant to help in the tidal action of the river, but it is also sort of being filled in for this new Bandra Kurla commercial complex that came up here a few years ago. Not few years ago, this would be around like early late 1990s. And so what you see in the backdrop is this big sort of commercial complex. And then the river finally culminates into the Arabian Ocean that's, again, lined by a small fishing village, but really, this sort of big development of these upscale sea-facing buildings. And you can see the huge sea link road that that's in the backdrop of the city. And so what also emerges is this highly complex landscape of governance and land ownership of the river. And so as you can see on the ground, it's highly complex in its fabric, but also the ownership of the river is very is divided between the state and the local agencies, and that sort of adds to the management issue. And so, so on July 2005, the city experienced a massive deluge as a result of high rainfall and high tide, which resulted in 500 plus people losing life and bringing the city to a complete standstill for 3 days. Now, the Mithi River was the primary cause of flooding, and many people literally call it the birthday of the Mithi River because nobody even knew that this river existed until this big sort of deluge happened, right? And so this is what happens, like our infrastructure systems sort of start to fall apart and really come into the foreground when there are these extreme climatic events. And so these are some of the images from the deluge, but since then it's been about 18, 19 years and the river still remains to be in a challenging state, and it's extremely polluted. And this is what my study participants were trying to reflect through the research study. And so just sort of like, tying back into the behavioral approach that I was actually prompting the participants to really respond to, they were asked to rate the effectiveness of each of these strategies, and I proposed 8 behavior change strategies for the decision-making community, and I asked them to evaluate whatever has happened since the past 18 years and their plans for future for this river based on these sort of 8 behavior change techniques. And this included environmental restructuring, service provisioning, regulations, disincentive, shaping knowledge and training, reward, social support, identity, self-belief, and comparison and modeling. And they were asked to rate an effectiveness of each of these strategies. And then they were also asked whether in their knowledge and in their sort of understanding, are any of these interventions being implemented in context of the river, and who would be the critical change agents for each of these techniques. I won't go into the detail here, but really sort of these techniques or the framework provided them sort of a way to evaluate all of the interventions that have been going on in the context of the river for the past 18 years, whether it's the dredging or whether it's disincentivizing or reward, trying to sort of mobilize community driven efforts, or there was also the BCT5, which really looks at shaping knowledge and training, where it's really about capacity building locally and professionally towards this river. So there were these range of techniques, but they were all sort of with a behavioral framework and regulations, service provisioning. So they were asked to evaluate this entire framework in context of the river. And so here is a quick overview of the results. And out of all the proposed behavior change techniques for the river restoration, they identified BCT2, that is service provisioning, as the most effective, followed by BCT5, which is shaping knowledge and training. And so they all collectively thought that disincentives were not as effective compared to other approaches in the river. And especially in the context of India, they felt that people are always looking to flout rules and find workarounds. And so they thought that, disincentives or regulations were not as effective as, reward or working on the more sort of social components. And then furthermore, as part of the survey, they were also each asked if these strategies were being implemented in the context of the river. And to the right side are the results, where in green were the yes responses, in orange were the no, and then, and some of them who said that these interventions were being partially implemented, their responses were recorded in the blue color on the right side. And so what emerges is that, this sort of big opportunity space where they thought that, this, where we see that the orange ones are really where these interventions are not being implemented, but they were all rated as highly effective. So what emerges is that this huge sort of opportunity space from the bottom 4 interventions, which is really shaping knowledge and training, looking at approaches for reward, where you create an expectation of recognition, or really identifying who the change agent or the projects that are really impacting the river transformation, looking at social support, identity, and self-belief, building social capital and agency, and comparison and modeling, which is really sort of benchmarking against successful projects, whether it's local or international. And so while these were the ones rated as highly effective, on the right, we can see that these were also the least implemented in the context of the river. And so when we can think of it, we can think of this approach as a consensus making exercise, where all the sort of possible interventions were evaluated by a decision-making community that had equal sort of contribution to this process. And one participant doesn't know who the other one is, but they're all equally engaging in assessing what these strategies could be, and where sort of we could focus more near short and long-term approaches. And they were each asked to identify change agents. And it's interesting that a lot of them mentioned governing agencies as the key change agents. And at the same time, they also thought that governing agencies were, or the governance issues were at the root cause of these problems. And so it's interesting that, while they sort of blame the governance to be as, the sort of root cause of this issue, they also see great potential in governing agencies as the key change agents, right? So what emerges is that there has to be a sort of a change in sort of the narrative in how the governance systems are really approaching this river, and this has to be thought more at the systemic level, and and sort of beyond these engineering approaches, where there has to be a narrative shift in how the interventions by the governing agencies are really impacting the river transformation. And this is just one snapshot of the research, but I wanted to like sort of zoom out this idea in how do you sort of reemphasize behavioral approaches thinking about infrastructure systems, which we all look through in our practice and research, or through your studies. And so and this is again related to some of my past research on planning sustainable cities through infrastructure systems, wherein we defined, 7 urban infrastructure systems, and they are everything sort of in physical form other than building structures in our environment. And, these cover landscape, transportation, energy, solid waste, water, information, and food. And so what I just described to you, the case of the Mithi River in Mumbai, could be one example or one subset of the water infrastructure. And this is just the stormwater aspect. But the fact is that, when we zoom out and really think about urban infrastructure systems, it's really this broad spectrum, and covering sort of multitude of environmental services. And then how do you sort of like start to break down and think about these urban infrastructure systems? And the first level for each of these systems could include it does actually cover the end users or the demand, in terms of how do you start planning for these infrastructure systems, and it becomes the principal input for the infrastructure planning. And then the second level really focuses on the strategic decisions concerning the selection of methods and resources to meet these demands that are identified by the first level. And then the third level includes the facilities of the systems functioning as nodes and interconnected through the other infrastructure networks. Now, the reason why I bring this up is that in all of these, for all these infrastructure systems, the first 2 levels where we start planning about, where we start thinking about the demand analysis, or, where the strategic decisions are involved, there are a lot of behavioral factors that can influence decision making and policies at these levels for each of these infrastructure systems. And so, like, as we all know, transportation system is all about sort of the choices and the decisions we make in terms of modes of transportation and access. I will quickly go through this and I will wrap up because I know we're kind of running against time. But the idea is that, when we think about sustainable infrastructure planning, there are these aspects of, there are behavioral aspects that can be considered at the strategic and the demand level for each of these infrastructure systems. So similarly, in water infrastructure, from management of watershed in terms of who is really contributing to the watershed in terms of land use, to human consumption of water, and the choices that we make in consumption and treatment of water infrastructure. These can all be driven by a behavioral framework. Similarly, we know in energy too, it's also the core of our climate change goals, where the choice architecture and the commitment to phase out fossil fuels is at the core. And then how do we sort of, consciously, the infrastructure has to move away from fossil fuels, but how sort of we also make choices in not just the domestic factor, but also like institutions and organizations, reassess their performance and, move towards away from fossil fuels, right? So this is behavioral decisions, not just at individual domestic levels, but also at institutional and group levels. And so we just, thinking about solid waste, there is a lot of research that has already been going on in terms of solid waste and waste management practices. This can be highly sort of controlled through behavioral insights and behavioral interventions. And then, information in a way is also infrastructure, right? It's sort of synergistic towards all our infrastructure systems, and, the performance of information really, information infrastructure really sort of guides how other infrastructure systems operate. And so, I mean, of course, we are all on social media, but also we can use the information infrastructure system to create feedback loops for performances and share and benchmarking. And so that's another critical way thinking about behavior and information systems. Again, in food choices, we know very well how our behavior and choices in what we eat, where we buy from, where we grow, how we grow locally to globally really drives the food infrastructure systems. And so I wanted to tie this back into, from sort of a more, case study looking at a very complex, vulnerable case of the Mumbai's Methi River to sort of, zooming out and understanding that, this approach is very much applicable to sort of all, urban practices if we start thinking about infrastructure systems. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to reinforce the concept of decision making in complex environments by foregrounding behavioral interventions. And this sort of helps us understand systems level governance as well as drives the narratives and perception of our urban resources. Most of them are under strain, as we all know it. And I showed you one example of, water, but it applies to, waste, energy, transportation, sort of all infrastructure management systems. And sort of another takeaway from this research and how I want to work going forward is the idea of co-produced knowledge, right? And so the decision-making community and how we sort of, bring together or formulate a decision-making community is really, guiding what decisions really impact the river. And so, this is the knowledge that they have as, locals, but also as experts. But this is a more representative group. And so what this co-produced knowledge comes out from the context is way more valuable than sort of, beginning from this very, technocratic approach of, big infrastructure solutions for these kind of complex issues. And finally, I just wanted to, close with these, the structure of my talk today. I know there's a lot that I shared, but hopefully, it just gives us a lot of things to think about. So that's me, Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Risha. That was very, very interesting. When you were talking about the governance issues, I was thinking about the work I've been doing in Puerto Rico, right? It's the same thing, right? They're looking at the NEPA process for coal ash, and there are 12 different entities who control that permit along the same river.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of complex governance system that sort of retards progress and co-creation because people become frustrated by going to 15 different hearings and repeatedly living through their trauma. Right.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But then it is also about, so ultimately, if it is really about these governance systems, then, how are we sort of, tying that into like policies and procedures? And, that's what we were talking about. But, is there still the target sort of behavior that we're still trying to look at? Because these processes are so cumbersome that, they just sort of, drain the people out of their, sort of their stewardship value to these resources. But I think it's exactly on what you were talking about. Yeah.
Well, folks, Phil, we have a few more minutes. I asked my question, right? If you have other questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Let's see, it looks like, or
I see there are things coming in, but
get your question in the chat, which Alice has just done. Alice wants to know, how do you develop the multidisciplinary skills to succeed in projects like this, which span very different areas of knowledge, like policy, human behavior, food, and water?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I came back to studying more after practice, but I feel like, just thinking back, really having a sort of much broader perspective when you are doing coursework and studying is really very critical, because we all sort of have certain ideas about okay, you want to learn GIS, or you want to learn land use planning, or you want to sort of really deep dive into ecological issues. But really these coursework or academia is the place where you can start experimenting with a lot of these ideas, because academia gave me the space and the time to really test out these things. And I kept thinking to myself that I'm trained as an architect, can I really study environmental psychology? Well, I didn't turn turn out to be an expert in environmental psychology, but I used the academic platform, to go and talk to, sociologists and psychologists, right? Not just within the university, but also in the sort of context of Mumbai that I was working in. I really sort of reached out to other experts. That's because I was using, these sort of academic research projects, which was my own dissertation, but, these really become the foundation to test out these ideas, right? And really sort of keeping a high level of engagement in terms of, the context, and where you're living and where you're working. And like Sandra and I was just discussing about, studio projects and, how these become the sort of test bed to, just, play out all these other ideas. So yeah, that's just my, response to you in short, that I really feel that there is no way to develop a skill set in either of these, but really use your academic platform and opportunity to at least explore all these ideas. So that there are these concepts you can come back to depending on what you end up doing in terms of practice, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Risha. We have a question. Dr. Carroll, one of our faculty members, has typed a question in. Annie, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I'm not
Would be delighted
in
to.
the chat, but yep.
Thank you. So my question was really, how have your engineering colleagues, kind of welcomed or been challenged by your people-centric approaches and recommendations for working with, cross disciplines, cross cultures?
Yeah, and that was really the sort of, that was a very lived experience of my academic journey, like doctoral journey. It was an interdisciplinary program, which was funded by, an engineering group that wanted to study behavioral science and engineering systems. My primary advisor, Lydie Klotz, had a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Engineering. My committee, which was also formed of Dr. Ellen Bassett, she is an expert in international development and planning. And I had an organizational behavior expert from the Darden School of Business. And so it was, I feel like whenever I presented my research, even in progress, it was really well received in the engineering domain, because I feel like, sort of positioning myself as a planner really helped me, present a wider perspective. And these are issues that are very relatable. I mean, these are things that you see all the time if you travel or if you have any exposure. And so, surprisingly, in the engineering field, it was pretty well received. Of course, at the end, it comes to what are the statistics that support your research and findings, and how are you going to publish this to impact practice. And of course, that happens, that follows the doctoral research. But it was pretty well received, and some of my colleagues who are actually trained as mechanical and civil engineers are studying, decision making and behavioral science in engineering companies and practices. So there are many aspects of behavior, and how you feel comfortable sharing your engineering ideas. And so they took on many sort of behavioral aspects based on this. And this was a consortium of convergent behavioral science initiative, and mine was just one of the other sort of several ways engineers were also thinking about behavior. So I would say it was pretty well received. But yes, a lot of the engineers then want to know, where are the statistics to support your findings? And there is some of that, but there is a lot of qualitative research as well over here.
We have one more question, time for one more question.
Okay.
From Brady. Brady writes, are these governing bodies of concern elected, appointed, or for hire? It's definitely a catch-22 when governing bodies are the agents of change but won't change. Depending on the situation now, sometimes planning has to step into the political sphere. I'm wondering if Brady wants to know if you agree with that.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, as planners, we're sort of like the knowledge brokers, right? Between not just the scientific and the community, but also the sort of, public bureaucratic, diplomacy level of things, and what happens at the ground level. So these change agents, or the respondents for at least my research, were a mix of, elected private agencies, educators. And so I think about 32% of them were elected officials. And so there's another aspect to it, like the catch-22 situation, right? They have like a 5-year cycle. And so, can the river really change in 5 years? Nobody knows. And so that also really, redirects their approaches in terms of how much they want to focus their resource and time on this project. And that's why, the idea of having a sort of a water association that has, a group of representatives that are committed to the longer term future of this river was one of the findings or recommendations of this research, that the Urban Water Association would be the sort of stable group of representatives that stay through the projects. They could be private or local community members, and then if the bureaucratic ones or appointed ones are rotating, there is at least one committed agency with incentives to actually keep doing this, and not just for free, who are appointed and have the decision-making power to keep rolling this on. And so these were some of the recommendations. But yeah, I completely agree with your point over there. It's a tricky one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, traditionally you're taught that planners are the technocrats, right? We shouldn't engage in politics. That's completely separate. And I think that's a little bit naive, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that is definitely not the way to. I mean, also, like, I think for me, as part of my fieldwork, the most difficult part was I had to take like appointments that ran into like 2-3 months to chase these appointed professionals. But the thing is that you cannot give up on them. And at the same time, there are these faith institutions that also are very critical change agents. Some of them were really difficult to reach, and some of them, were way more willing. And so it's really important to understand, like, as part of this fieldwork or, research, who are the who are the decision makers that are easier to, get to or talk to, versus, who are the ones that are, environmental activists will always be the ones, with the sort of biggest voice, and they use these platforms to share their concerns. But the appointed officials were the most difficult. And I mean, I definitely did not give up. I think almost for like at the end of 7 months, I was still chasing one official, and then we ended up, becoming good friends. But because, knowing that I'm a researcher and I'm coming from academia, they will engage with you and they will, support you. And I feel like that's the benefit of being a researcher versus representing any other entity. So yeah.
Well, that is all we have time for. There is
Yeah.
another question in the chat, but I'm going to copy that into an email
Okay.
For you and between you and the sender.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us
you.
today and sharing your research. As Risha said, we are developing a course an international course on cities and climate, and these kind of issues are going to be included. So if you enjoyed this talk, stay tuned. The course is going to be offered in the near future.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Risha. Again, it was our pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, Sandy.